Think Native American village food was just corn, beans, and squash? Think again. You're about to uncover 25 real historical recipes, from blood-boiled corn soup and charred ant broth to boiled skunk with juniper berries. These dishes may sound shocking, but they were never gimmicks. Each was rooted in ceremony, survival, and deep respect for the land. This isn't a horror story about food. It's a tribute to the strength, creativity, and traditions of Native communities. Stick around, and you'll uncover 25 untold dishes that reveal a forgotten world of survival, skill, and flavor. Some are wild, some are sacred, and a few will leave your jaw on the floor. 1. Acorn worm stew. At first glance, it looked like a bowl of thick brown soup, but hidden beneath the surface were tiny white worms, stirred in on purpose. Across California and parts of the Pacific Northwest, tribes like the Miwok and Pomo collected acorns from oak trees every fall. But they didn't just gather the nuts. They also collected the worms inside them, the creamy little grubs that tunneled through the acorns after they dropped. While most people today would throw that away, Native families once saw it as extra protein gifted by nature. They'd grind the acorns into a meal, leach out the bitterness with water, then simmer it slowly with herbs, sometimes mixing in wild greens or bits of smoked meat. At the end, in went the worms, soft, mild, and packed with fat. Some called it survival food, but to many it was simply tradition. A stew that turned pests into power and reminded every child at the fire that nothing from the earth was wasted. Some even believed the worms gave extra strength for winter hunts, a quiet wisdom passed down in each wooden bowl. 2. Buffalo blood pudding. When a buffalo was hunted, nothing was thrown away, not the bones, not the hide, and definitely not the blood. Among plains tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne, buffalo blood was collected fresh from the hunt and whisked with wild herbs, fat, and ground-up organ meat. The thick mixture was then poured into a stomach or cleaned intestine and boiled over a fire until it firmed into a dark, rich pudding. The result? A dense, iron-packed sausage that could be sliced, dried, or eaten warm. It wasn't just food, it was fuel, rich in protein and spirit. Some tribes believed the blood carried the life force of the buffalo, and by eating it, they honored the animal's sacrifice and absorbed its strength. To outsiders, it may sound off-putting, but for the people of the plains, this dish was a sacred connection to the land, a way to eat with gratitude, not just hunger. Sometimes it was served with berries or roots to balance the strong flavor. And in harsh winters, just a few slices could mean the difference between weakness and survival. 3. Smoked beaver tail. To many tribes in the northern forests, the beaver wasn't just a clever animal, it was a lifeline. And its tail? That was the prize. Beaver tail was thick, fatty, and covered in a tough, leathery skin. But once it was skinned, cleaned, and slow-smoked over cedar wood, it turned into something unlike anything else, rich, gelatinous, and deeply flavorful. Tribes like the Ojibwe and Cree prized it during cold months when fat was hard to come by. It was often cooked whole, then sliced and shared in small bites, not for the faint of heart, but treasured for its warmth and energy. Elders believed it helped keep the body strong during long winters when hunting was hard and the cold cut deep. Some called it the forest's butter, because just a little would coat your mouth and stick to your ribs. And if you were offered a piece, you didn't say no, not just out of respect, but because it meant you were being trusted with something sacred. Even today, a few remote communities still remember the taste, not for pleasure, but for the power it gave when food was scarce. 4. Roasted grasshopper cakes. Out on the plains, when big game was scarce and the land turned dry, Native American tribes turned to something small, but packed with protein, grasshoppers. But they didn't just eat them raw. Grasshoppers were caught in bundles, roasted until crisp, then ground and mixed with cornmeal, herbs, and water to form small cakes. These were fried on hot stones or cooked over an open fire. The result? Crunchy on the outside, chewy inside, with a nutty, earthy flavor. They were easy to carry, didn't spoil, and gave warriors energy for long days of travel or hunting. In some tribes, kids even saw them as a treat. It might sound strange now, but back then, if the ground was crawling, you weren't starving, you were blessed. Some stories even say the crunch of these cakes could be heard before you smelled the smoke, a signal that food, however humble, was being shared. And deep in tribal memory, one version of this cake had a mystery ingredient only added during sacred hunts. What was it? Let's just say, the next recipe on this list might have you looking twice at your backyard. 5. Corn and ash cakes baked in the ground. This wasn't just bread, it was survival science. Native American cooks didn't need ovens. They dug shallow pits, filled them with hot coals, and buried dough wrapped in husks right into the earth. Made from cornmeal, water, and sometimes mashed beans or wild seeds, the dough would bake slowly under the ashes. What came out was a smoky, chewy cake with a toasted crust and soft center. The ash gave it an earthy taste and sometimes even added minerals missing from the diet. Some tribes believed this method gave the food more power, as if the earth itself was feeding them. And here's the strange part. Under the charred crust, the cake often had a hidden filling or flavor. One you'd never guess came from something buried underground. These cakes weren't just made for meals. They were also used in ceremonies, offered to spirits, or shared during seasonal festivals. Kids grew up learning not just how to cook them, but how to read them, like messages baked in smoke and soil. 6. Pond lily root mash. Pond lilies may look peaceful floating on still water, but beneath them, that's where the real treasure lay. Tribes across the southeast waded into the mud, searching for the thick white roots, twisted, heavy, and packed with starch. They'd boil them for hours, sometimes mash them with wild onions or a bit of fat if they had it. The result? A bitter, earthy paste that stuck to your ribs and stayed with you. It wasn't made to taste good. It was made to last, through long winters, empty hunts, and hungry bellies. But not all roots were safe. Some carried a poison you couldn't see. No spots, no color change, just a quiet danger that crept in after dark. The elders knew the sign. If the steam hissed like a snake and the air turned sour, you didn't eat it. You covered it back with soil and gave it back to the earth. And that hissing sound? The sharp, foul smell rising with the steam? It shows up again in the next dish, only this time it came from the meat itself. Because, yes, the next recipe started with a skunk. 7. Boiled skunk with juniper berries. You read that right. Skunk. Boiled, not burned, not hidden, but carefully prepared and served by families who knew exactly what they were doing. In parts of the Great Plains and the Southwest, when game ran low, tribes turned to whatever the land gave. Skunks were trapped, cleaned with precision, and boiled slowly with herbs like juniper berries, which masked the musky odor and gave the meat a wild, piney flavor. The trick wasn't just in cooking it, it was in not messing it up. One wrong cut, and the meat would stink beyond saving. But done right? It was tender, rich, and surprisingly mild. Some even said it tasted like rabbit with a smoky edge. This wasn't shock food, it was skill food. Knowing how to turn a feared animal into a respected meal took patience and guts. And in some circles, being served a slice of skunk meat meant you were being trusted or tested. But there was one animal even harder to prepare, one that didn't just stink, it bit back. And the only way to cook it was with hot stones. 8. Woodrat on hot stones. High in the deserts and canyons of the Southwest, tribes like the Hopi and Paiute hunted a creature most folks today wouldn't even touch, the woodrat. Not a sewer rat, not a garbage scavenger, but a wild, clean-eating animal that lived off cactus, seeds, and desert roots. They trapped them at night, skinned and gutted them at dawn, and then came the magic, cooking them on heated river stones buried in the earth. The meat was wrapped in leaves or laid directly on the rocks, then covered with more stones and soil, turning the desert floor into a slow cooker. The result? A crisp outer sear with juicy, tender meat inside, slightly gamey, slightly sweet, and in lean times, absolutely treasured. Kids were taught how to hunt them quietly, how to prep them without waste, and how to share every bite. Because in a land with little water and fewer guarantees, even the smallest catch was sacred. But deep in the desert, there was one catch even rarer than the woodrat. And it wasn't born. It was still growing in the womb. 9. Deer Fetus Stew. It was a dish never spoken of lightly, reserved for the harshest winters or sacred occasions. Among some plains and woodland tribes, when a pregnant doe was hunted for survival, the unborn fawn was not discarded. It was honored. The tiny fetus, still soft and undeveloped, was simmered gently into a stew with wild onions, roots, and sometimes crushed juniper or mint. The meat was delicate, almost gelatinous, and deeply rich in nutrients. It was said to strengthen the weak, aid recovery, and connect the eater with the spirit of the deer in its purest form. This wasn't a casual meal. It was made with quiet hands and eaten in silence. Some elders believed that by consuming life before it fully formed, you carried its future and its memory inside you. To many, it was one of the most powerful meals a person could ever be offered. But if that made you pause, wait till you hear what they did with ants. Not just the ants, the fire that cooked them too. 10. Charred Ant Broth. They didn't just eat the ants, they turned them into soup. In parts of the Southwest and Great Basin, tribes like the Havasupai and Ute collected entire mounds of red ants, stingers and all. Armed with sticks, baskets, and smoke, they'd gather the swarms, then roast them alive on hot stones until their bodies crackled and smoked. Once charred, the ants were ground into a fine, dark powder and boiled with water, herbs, and sometimes crushed seeds or dried cactus fruit. The result? A tangy, almost citrusy broth with a smoky finish, packed with protein, minerals, and yes, heat. Some say the stingers gave it a spicy kick that lingered in the throat. It was used not just as food, but as medicine, especially during illness or after childbirth. And for the young warriors, it was a test of grit. If you could drink the ant broth without flinching, you were ready. But that wasn't the strangest soup on the list. The next one starts with a turtle and ends with something you've never seen on a menu. 11. Turtle liver and wild plum soup. Turtles were more than just slow-moving creatures by the water's edge. They were considered a rare and powerful food source, and when a turtle was caught, every part of it was used, especially the liver. Among southeastern tribes like the Choctaw and Creek, the liver was believed to be the richest, most nourishing part of the animal. It was simmered gently in a broth made from the turtle's own bones, wild herbs, and tart wild plums gathered during the summer. The sourness of the fruit cut through the richness of the liver, creating a bold, almost sweet and savory soup unlike anything else. It wasn't a dish you ate casually. It was often made during healing rituals or reserved for elders recovering from illness. To be served turtle liver was to be cared for, deeply and deliberately. But once the pot was empty and the bones were buried, another kind of meal was prepared, one with no shell, no fur, and no legs, just hundreds of tiny, sun-dried surprises waiting to be chewed. 12. Sun-dried snail jerky. Most folks wouldn't even stop to notice them, slow, silent, tucked beneath wet leaves. But to eastern tribes like the Shawnee and Iroquois, snails were more than just forest crawlies. They were bite-sized gifts from the land. Early in the morning, just after the dew settled, families would collect them by hand, one by one. After purging them to clean out their systems, the snails were boiled until the meat slipped free. Then, carefully laid out on wooden planks or hung on woven strands, they were left to dry in the sun. Over a few days they'd shrink into tough, curled pieces, salty, earthy, and surprisingly filling. Some were chewed like jerky. Others were saved for stews, ground into powder, or carried in pouches for long treks. They didn't spoil, didn't weigh much, and gave energy when almost nothing else could. But not all dried meats were this simple. Out on the plains, one animal offered even more fat and flavor, but collecting it meant getting past a back full of barbed armor, and only the bold dared turn it into sausage. 13. Porcupine Gut Sausage. Yes, you read that right. Native tribes of the northern plains and forested regions didn't just hunt porcupines for meat. They turned their insides into sausage. After carefully removing the quills, a delicate process all on its own, the animal was skinned and cleaned. But instead of tossing the intestines, they were washed thoroughly, stuffed with chopped organ meat, fat, wild herbs, and even crushed berries or pine nuts. The ends were tied off, and the sausage was roasted over open fire or laid near hot stones until browned and firm. The result? A rich, oily, smoky sausage packed with flavor and fat, the kind that could keep a hunter warm through a frozen night. It was both prized and practical, especially when larger game was scarce. Elders said porcupine meat brought strength. But the gut sausage? That was for the brave, not just to eat, but to prepare. One slip, and those razor-sharp quills could leave your hands bleeding for days. But danger didn't always come with fur and spikes. Sometimes it buzzed, and it came in a nest. 14. Spicy hornet nest soup. While most people ran the other way, some native tribes saw a hornet's nest as a challenge and an opportunity. In certain regions of the South and Southwest, especially during late summer, hornet nests were carefully smoked out and harvested. The adult hornets were shaken loose, but the prize wasn't them. It was the larvae tucked inside, white, plump, and protein-rich. The larvae were scooped out, rinsed, and boiled with wild herbs, fire-roasted chilies, and sometimes a thick root broth. The result? A spicy, tangy soup with a strange pop in every bite. Some said it gave heat to the body and sharpness to the mind. Gathering the nest was no joke. One wrong move, and you'd be sprinting home with a face full of stings. But if done right, this meal fed more than just the stomach. It fed courage, and that courage would be needed for what came next, because the next animal didn't crawl, didn't sting. It flew in the night, and it came with wings. 15. Smoked bat with berry glaze. High in the cliffs and canyons of the American Southwest, tribes like the Zuni and Apache hunted something most people today wouldn't dream of eating: bats. Using nets woven from yucca fiber or trapping them near cave mouths at dusk, hunters would gather the small fruit bats that fed on native berries and cactus nectar. After cleaning, the bats were split open, seasoned lightly with wild herbs, and then smoked slowly over mesquite or juniper wood. But here's where it got interesting. Toward the end of the smoking process, a glaze was brushed on. Made from crushed wild berries and honey or tree sap, it gave the crispy skin a sweet, tangy finish. The meat itself? Thin, gamey, and full of iron, but the smoky sweet bite made it surprisingly enjoyable. This wasn't a common meal. It was a special one. Some believed eating bat gave a hunter sharper instincts, especially at night. And for others it was a way to honor the creature's speed and silent strength. But if bats gave you speed, the next dish? It gave you heat, and it came from a soup made of fire itself. 16. Spicy fire ash soup. This wasn't your average hot meal, it was heat from the inside out. In the arid Southwest, where nights could freeze and food ran thin, tribes like the Navajo crafted a soup that lived up to its name. They started with the fine, powdery ash left behind from burned mesquite or juniper wood. Not the chunks, just the pure gray dust sifted by hand. Into a pot went boiled wild onions, bitter desert greens, and crushed dried chilies, sometimes so hot they made eyes water just by stirring. Then came the ash, whisked in like flour, thickening the broth and giving it a deep, smoky punch. The result? A peppery, charcoal-rich soup that burned going down and left a trail of warmth behind. Some said it could flush out illness. Others swore it brought dreams of fire spirits. Either way, it cleared your head and cleared a room. But once the fire faded, there was something even rarer, something that might crawl between your toes, yet the stench was so strong that it can make you cry. 17. Stinkbug stone broil. Yes, stinkbugs. Sharp-smelling, bitter-tasting little beetles that most folks today wouldn't go near. But to some southwestern tribes like the Havasupai and Yavapai, these tiny creatures were gathered during dry seasons when protein was scarce. The bugs were roasted on flat river stones, which drew out the worst of the stench and left behind a strong, peppery crunch. The secret was in the smoke. Sometimes sage or pine needles were tossed into the fire to mask the odor and infuse the bugs with a foresty flavor. They weren't eaten by the handful, but a few sprinkled over roasted corn or chewed before hunts were believed to bring heat and alertness. Elders warned, eat too many, and your mouth might go numb. But just enough. You'd walk sharper, feel warmer, and maybe even dream stronger. Some say the warriors who ate stinkbugs before battle felt braver, not because of the bug's bite, but because eating them proved nothing in nature scared you. The stronger the smell, the stronger the soul. And just when you think bugs were the last frontier, the next food wasn't hunted. It was scraped off from the tree. 18. Bear fat and pine bark crumble. When food was scarce and winter showed no mercy, native tribes of the far north turned to something most would never imagine eating: tree bark. But not just any bark. It had to be the soft inner layer of pine trees, known as the cambium. This thin, slightly sweet layer was carefully scraped from young pines, dried, and ground into flakes. Then came the magic. It was toasted in a pan with rich bear fat, golden, greasy, and full of flavor. As it sizzled, the bark would crisp up like toasted oats. Some tribes even added crushed berries or dried fish bits for extra flavor and nutrition. The result was a warm, fatty crumble, smoky, crunchy, and shockingly satisfying. It stuck to your ribs, lifted your spirits, and carried you just a little further into the cold. Some even believed eating the bark brought strength from the tree itself, grounding the body with the wisdom of the forest. But while this dish came from the forest, the next came from a place far more dangerous, and it slithered. 19. Boiled rattlesnake and root greens. In the deserts and scrublands of the American Southwest, survival meant facing danger head-on, and sometimes eating it. Rattlesnakes weren't just feared, they were hunted. Tribes like the Apache and Hopi would track them with care, using forked sticks to pin the head before delivering a quick strike. Once skinned and cleaned, the meat, long, lean, and full of muscle, was coiled into a pot and boiled with wild root greens like amaranth or tansy mustard. The broth turned rich and slightly oily, and the meat, though firm, flaked apart like fish. It was said to boost stamina, heal the body, and sharpen a hunter's reflexes. The rattle was often kept as a charm, a reminder that danger, when faced with wisdom, could become nourishment. Some hunters even believed eating rattlesnake gave you the creature's spirit, calm under pressure, lightning fast when needed. Children were taught to never waste a single piece, and elders often boiled the bones into tea for healing. What most feared, they turned into strength. But there was one dish that didn't hiss or sting. It buzzed, and it started with stealing from a bee. 20. Wild bee larvae mash. Deep in the forests and meadows of the Midwest and Southeast, native tribes didn't just harvest honey. They went after what was hiding underneath it, the larvae. After smoking out wild hives or carefully breaking open tree hollows, they collected the waxy combs and picked out the pale, squirming larvae tucked inside. These were gently roasted over hot stones or mashed raw with wild berries and nuts to create a thick, gritty paste, rich in protein, fat, and natural sugars. The texture? Creamy with a slight crunch. The flavor? Nutty, sweet, and a little wild, like nature's version of peanut butter. It was food for young warriors, nursing mothers, or anyone who needed serious strength fast. Some tribes believed bee larvae held the energy of the sun itself, a gift from the sky passed through flowers into flesh. Children were taught to respect the hive, to take only what was needed, to leave enough behind for the bees to thrive. But not all gifts were so sweet. The next dish came from something resembling a Thanksgiving dinner, but it is not the part that you will expect. 21. Turkey feet and cactus soup. While many tossed the feet, native tribes saw them as gold. In the dry Southwest, where waste was never an option, the feet of wild turkeys were cleaned, skinned, and boiled down until the tendons turned to gelatin and the bones softened. Into the bubbling pot went sliced cactus pads, the kind with the thorns scraped off and the inside diced into tender strips. The result was a tangy, slippery soup rich in collagen, minerals, and desert flavor. The turkey feet gave it body, the cactus gave it bite, and together they made a stew that could keep you going through the longest hunt. Kids would chew the cartilage right off the bone, crunchy, chewy, and full of flavor. Elders swore by its healing power for sore joints and weak bones. Even the preparation was part of the lesson. Young ones were taught how to remove the nails, clean between the toes, and respect every part of the animal. But some dishes didn't come from bird or beast. Some came from the very ground you walked on, even if most people today wouldn't dare eat it. 22. Steamed lichen dumplings. In rocky forests and high mountain regions, where food was often scarce, native tribes like the Shoshone and Salish turned to something most people wouldn't dream of eating: lichen. Not the dry, crusty kind, but a soft, black variety known as tree moss. They gathered it by hand, cleaned it in cold river water, and sometimes boiled it to remove the bitterness. Then they mixed it with crushed acorns or dried berries, shaped it into sticky dumplings, and steamed them over hot stones or in underground pits. The result? A chewy, earthy ball of survival. It didn't look like much, but it filled the belly and kept the body warm. Elders believed the moss carried the strength of the mountains, quiet, steady, and nourishing. Some tribes even added fish oil or rendered fat to the mix, turning the dumplings into dense energy balls for long journeys. These weren't just eaten. They were packed, traded, and handed to travelers as tokens of safe passage. In some regions, moss dumplings were seen as sacred, a symbol that even in the harshest terrain the land still provided. But not all bark was soft. One food required you to go to the lakes or river to find, but it is not the part where you would always eat. 23. Fish head pudding. To many tribes in the Northeast and Great Lakes regions, tossing out a fish head wasn't just wasteful. It was unthinkable. From salmon to trout, every part of the catch was used, but the head held something special: fat, flavor, and honor. The heads were boiled down until the bones softened and the cheeks melted into the broth. Then came the thickener: cornmeal, ground cattail root, or even mashed wild rice. It was stirred and steamed until it formed a dense, rich pudding with chunks of eye, jaw, and tongue still intact. The elders said the eyes helped you see clearly through snowstorms and lies. Some families saved this dish for elders or sick children, believing the head carried the wisdom of the water. Others passed it around during winter councils when stories were shared and nothing went to waste. But not all the bones were soft. Some tribes boiled the skulls longer and carved them after, turning leftovers into charms or tools, because once the pudding was gone, the spirit of the fish still had work to do. And while the forest offered this quiet gift, the next dish came from an unborn egg, preserved through time. 24. Pickled duck embryos in clay. Among certain Native American communities near marshlands and river deltas, like the Chinook or tribes along the Mississippi, wild duck eggs weren't always eaten fresh. Some were harvested mid-development, when the embryo had already begun to grow. Instead of discarding them, they were carefully preserved using one of the oldest natural techniques: clay pickling. The eggs, still warm from the nest, were wrapped in a slurry of river clay and wood ash, then buried near cool creek beds for days or even weeks. The clay sealed them tight, while the ash slowly cured the inside. When cracked open later, the yolk had turned creamy, the young duckling partially formed, and the taste, earthy, sour, rich, was unlike anything modern palates are used to. It was eaten in slices, sometimes with wild mustard leaves or tart berries to cut through the richness. Elders said it gave new life to those recovering from illness or childbirth, and that it honored the life cycle by consuming it at the edge of beginning. And the final recipe? Let's just say it didn't walk, swim, or fly. It clung to the walls of caves and hummed. 25. Cavecricut paste. Deep in the shadowy cracks of canyon walls and limestone caves, where sunlight barely touched, lived one of the strangest food sources native tribes ever used: cave crickets. These long-legged, humpbacked insects weren't easy to catch. You had to move quiet, wait for nightfall, and sometimes smoke them out with smoldering sage or dry moss. Once gathered, the crickets were roasted on flat stones until their shells popped. Then they were ground into a thick, dark paste, sometimes with crushed seeds, ash, or even marrow for extra body. The result? A bitter, protein-packed spread that smelled like damp earth and smoke. It was smeared onto bark, wrapped in leaves, or stirred into broth. Not made for feasting, but for enduring. The kind of food carried on long journeys or hidden in winter storage caches, meant to fuel bodies when everything else had run dry. Some said the cave crickets carried the spirit of the earth itself, quiet, tough, and patient. Eating them was a lesson that even in the darkest corners of the world, life clings on and gives back. And there you have it, 25 untold Native American recipes you didn't know existed. These weren't just meals, they were survival stories, sacred knowledge passed through smoke, fire, and memory. If you made it this far, you've tasted history most people have never heard of, and likely never will. So, if this opened your eyes, hit that like button, share this with someone who thinks food has to come from a grocery store, and subscribe for more forgotten pieces of America's past, because we're just getting started. And the next story might either change the way you see your dinner plate or work up a strong appetite.